"Mrs. Carter, your name isn't on the list," the receptionist said, and just like that, I understood that my own life had been moved forward without me. I stood there for a second, my hand still resting on the polished brass handle of the conference room door, the same hand that had held my husband's at his funeral just 3 days ago, and I felt something inside me go very still. I had chosen a simple black dress that morning, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, just something appropriate for a woman who had been married for 32 years, and was now expected to sit quietly while the pieces of that life were sorted out. Through the narrow strip of glass beside the door, I could see them already seated around the long table, dark suits, neat folders, cups of coffee placed carefully on coasters as if this were just another business meeting. My son Daniel sat closest to the head of the table, his posture straight, his expression composed in that way I used to admire when he was younger, when I thought it meant he was steady, dependable. Now it looked different. Now it looked like distance. He didn't look toward the door. He didn't look toward me. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice quieter than I expected, as if even it understood it wasn't supposed to make trouble. The receptionist gave me a polite smile, the kind that doesn't invite conversation. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The meeting is for listed participants only." Listed participants. I almost repeated the phrase just to hear how it sounded out loud, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded as if that made sense, as if a woman could somehow be left out of the meeting where her own husband's life was being reduced to documents and signatures. I stepped back from the door before anyone inside could notice me standing there, before I could give Daniel the chance to decide whether or not to acknowledge me. That choice, I realized, had already been made. The hallway was quiet, carpet soft under my shoes, the kind that muffles sound so completely you start to feel like you don't exist in it. I found a chair against the wall and sat down, smoothing my dress over my knees, the same small, automatic gesture I had made 1,000 times at church, at dinners, at every gathering where I had been expected to present a calm, acceptable version of myself. I didn't knock. I didn't argue. I didn't call his name. Inside the room, I could hear the faint murmur of voices, the low cadence of men discussing things that mattered, things that apparently no longer included me. 3 days ago, I had stood beside a casket and listened as people spoke about my husband as if he had been the center of everything. Today, I was sitting 10 feet away from a table where that center was being redistributed, and I had been placed outside of it. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the closed door, noticing small details I might have missed before, the slight reflection of the overhead lights on the wood, the way the handle caught the light just enough to look warmer than the rest of the room. It occurred to me then, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of quiet clarity, that this was not something that had happened suddenly. This was not a misunderstanding or a scheduling error. This was a decision, careful one, a prepared one, and I had not been part of it. I sat there, listening to the muted sounds of a meeting I was no longer invited to, and realized that being excluded wasn't the most painful part. The most painful part was how naturally it had been done. I stayed in that chair long enough for the hallway to begin feeling familiar, as if I had always belonged there instead of inside that room, and I let my eyes rest on the framed certificates lining the wall, each one bearing a name, a title, a date, proof that someone's presence had once been acknowledged, recorded, made official, and I wondered quietly when my own presence had stopped being something worth documenting. The air conditioning hummed softly above me, steady and indifferent, and I pulled my coat a little closer around my shoulders even though I was not truly cold, not in the way that mattered. Inside the conference room, a chair scraped lightly against the floor, followed by the low murmur of Daniel's voice, calm, controlled, the same voice that used to call me every Sunday morning just to ask if I had slept well, if I needed anything from the grocery store, if I had remembered to take my medication. That voice had once carried concern. Now it carried distance. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to listen more carefully, to separate the tones, to understand the rhythm of what was happening just a few feet away. Papers shifted. Someone cleared their throat. Pen clicked twice in quick succession. Small sounds, ordinary sounds, but together they formed something unmistakable. Decisions were being made. And I was not part of them. It was not always like this. Just a few weeks ago, Daniel had been standing in my kitchen, leaning against the counter, asking casually where his father kept the property documents, whether there were copies of the insurance policies, whether I knew the password to the safe in the study. I had answered without hesitation, without suspicion, because that is what mothers do when their children ask questions. We provide answers. We do not interrogate intentions. At the time, I told myself he was trying to help, trying to take responsibility after his father's health began to decline. I remember how he had said, "You should not have to worry about all of this, Mom. You have done enough." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Sitting there in that hallway, I realized that sentence had not been an act of kindness. It had been a transition, a quiet repositioning of roles that I had not noticed until I was no longer standing where I used to be. I opened my eyes again and looked at the door, still closed, still separating me from whatever version of my life they were now organizing. Through the thin gap at the bottom, I could see a faint line of light, steady and uninterrupted, and I found myself focusing on it, as if that narrow strip was the only confirmation that something was still happening on the other side. My hands rested in my lap, fingers lightly intertwined, the wedding ring still in place, its weight both familiar and newly significant. 3 days without my husband, and already the structure he had built around me was being adjusted, reinterpreted, reassigned. I did not feel anger rising in me. Not yet. What I felt was something quieter, something that settled deeper. A recognition. The kind that does not arrive all at once, but unfolds slowly, piece by piece, until the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. Daniel had not forgotten to include me. He had chosen not to. And the difference between those two things was everything. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting my shoulders rest against the firm upholstery, and I allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for my thoughts to settle into something clearer, something more structured than the quiet confusion I had felt at first, because confusion suggests uncertainty, and I was beginning to understand that there was nothing uncertain about what was happening. This had been planned, carefully, deliberately, and over time. The realization did not come with a sharp sting but with a slow, steady weight, like something being placed into my hands piece by piece until I could no longer pretend I was holding nothing at all. I thought about the study at home, the one Thomas had always kept so meticulously organized, every document in its proper folder, every file labeled in his precise handwriting, and how Daniel had started spending more time in that room over the past month, sometimes alone, sometimes with his laptop open, asking me small practical questions that seemed harmless on their own. "Do you know where Dad kept the original deed? Was there ever a second insurance policy? Did he ever mention updating anything recently?" At the time, I had answered him with the same openness I had always given him, because I had never needed to question his intentions before. That is the quiet privilege of being a mother. You assume your child is moving toward you, not away from you. I let out a slow breath and glanced again at the closed door, noticing how steady it remained, how firmly it separated me from the voices inside, and I realized that the distance I was feeling now had not started today. It had been building, quietly, in moments I had dismissed, in conversations I had trusted too easily. There had been that evening in the kitchen when Daniel stood by the sink, his back half turned to me and said, "You should not have to manage everything on your own anymore." And I had heard concern in his voice, even gratitude, as if he was stepping into a role that would ease my burden. But now, sitting here, I understood the shift in those words. He had not been offering to stand beside me. He had been preparing to stand in front of me. I folded my hands a little tighter in my lap, feeling the slight pressure of my fingers against each other, grounding myself in something tangible, something that still belonged entirely to me. Inside the room I heard another voice, now deeper, more measured, likely Michael Bennett, and there was a pause afterward that felt heavier than the others, the kind of pause that follows a statement meant to carry weight. I could not make out the exact words, but I could feel the change in tone, the way the air shifted even through a closed door. My eyes moved once more to the thin line of light beneath it, steady and unwavering, and I found myself thinking about how many times in my life I had stood just outside of something important, waiting to be invited in, trusting that the invitation would come. This time it had not. And that absence, that deliberate exclusion, told me more than any conversation ever could. I was not being overlooked. I was being removed. And the most unsettling part was not the act itself, but how quietly it had been carried out, how easily my place had been reassigned without a single raised voice, without a single moment of visible conflict. It was clean. It was efficient. It was final. Or at least that is what they believed. I let my gaze drift away from the door for a moment, Not because I had stopped paying attention, but because I needed somewhere else to place my thoughts, somewhere quieter than the steady realization forming in my chest, and that was when I found myself thinking about Thomas, not in the way people do at funerals with soft words and rehearsed memories, but in the practical, grounded way I had known him for decades, the way he handled things when he sensed something was not quite right, the way he never rushed to confront a problem but never ignored it either. There had been an afternoon about 2 months before he passed, when he sat at the edge of our bed with a folder resting on his lap, the late afternoon sunlight coming through the curtains and catching the edges of the papers inside, and he had looked at me with that same calm expression he always wore, when he had already made up his mind about something important. "If anything ever feels off," he had said, his voice steady, not dramatic, not fearful, just certain, "do not assume it will fix itself." I remember smiling at him then, brushing it off gently, telling him he worried too much, that everything would be fine, because that is what you say when you have spent a lifetime believing your family moves together, not against itself. He had not argued. He never did when he knew something I did not. Instead, he had closed the folder, placed it carefully inside his desk drawer, and changed the subject to something ordinary, something light, as if that moment had not carried any particular weight. Sitting in that hallway now, I realized it had carried more weight than I had allowed myself to see. I shifted slightly in my seat, the fabric of the chair pressing softly against my back, grounding me in the present even as my thoughts moved through the past, connecting things that had once felt separate. Thomas had always trusted people, but he had never been naive. There was a difference I had not fully appreciated until now. Trust, to him, was something you offered, but protection was something you prepared. Inside the conference room, the voices rose slightly, just enough for me to catch a fragment of a sentence, something about timelines, about next steps, about moving forward efficiently, and the phrasing struck me with a quiet precision. Efficiently. It was the same word Daniel had used the week before when he suggested we start organizing paperwork early, just to make things easier later. At the time I had agreed, grateful that he was thinking ahead, grateful that I would not have to handle everything alone. Now that word felt different. It felt like a boundary being drawn without my knowledge. I lowered my eyes to my hands again, noticing the faint lines in my skin, the subtle tremor that had not been there a few years ago, and I understood how easily someone could look at me and decide that I no longer needed to be included in decisions, that things could be handled for me instead of with me. That thought did not make me angry. It made me precise. I looked back at the door, at the handle that had not moved, at the line of light that had not shifted, and I remembered the way Thomas had placed that folder into his desk, not carelessly, not as an afterthought, but with intention, as if he knew there might come a moment when I would need something more than assumptions to stand on. I did not know yet what was inside that folder, or if it even had anything to do with what was happening now, but I knew this much with a clarity that settled deeply and did not waver. Thomas had not been the kind of man who left things unfinished. And whatever he had prepared, whatever he had anticipated, it was not meant to be ignored. I shifted slightly in my seat when the door opened just a few inches, not enough to invite anyone in or out, just enough for a thin slice of movement to escape into the hallway, and I caught a clearer glimpse of the room beyond, the edge of the long table, the dark sleeve of Daniel's suit, the polished surface reflecting the overhead lights in a way that made everything inside look deliberate and controlled, and then I heard his voice more distinctly this time, no longer muffled into soft fragments but shaped into something I could understand. "We should keep this straightforward," he said, calm and measured, the same tone he used when he wanted something to sound reasonable. "There is no need to complicate things unnecessarily." There was a pause after that, followed by another voice, quieter, perhaps questioning, and then Daniel again, slightly firmer now. "My mother will be taken care of course, but it makes more sense to handle the assets efficiently." Efficiently. The word settled into the space around me like something final, something already agreed upon. I did not move. I did not lean closer to hear more. I simply let the words reach me as they were, without chasing them, without interrupting them, because what I had already heard was enough. "She does not need to be involved in every step," he continued, and there was a faint sound of papers being adjusted, as if his statement had been accompanied by a gesture, a hand moving across the table, pointing, directing, organizing. I looked down at my hands again, at the ring that still rested there, and I realized that in that room at that table I had already been repositioned into something smaller, something manageable, something that could be accounted for without being consulted. Taken care of. The phrase was meant to sound kind. It was not. It was a decision made without me, dressed in language that suggested consideration. I let out a slow breath, careful, controlled, the kind that does not draw attention, and I felt the last trace of uncertainty leave me. There was no misunderstanding here. No miscommunication. No accidental oversight. This was a plan, and it had been discussed, agreed upon, and put into motion before I ever walked into this building. The door eased closed again, the narrow opening disappearing, sealing the room back into its quiet, contained space, and with it, the voices softened once more into indistinct sound, but they no longer needed to be clear. I had heard enough to understand not just what they were doing but how they saw me while they were doing it. Not as a partner. Not as someone whose life had been built alongside the man they were now discussing, but as a detail. A responsibility. Something to be handled. I lifted my eyes back to the door, studying it with a calmness that felt different now, more grounded, less uncertain, and I realized that whatever Thomas had prepared, whatever he had placed into that folder with such quiet intention, it had not been created out of fear or doubt. It had been created out of understanding. He had seen something I had not allowed myself to see. And now, sitting just outside that room, listening to my life being arranged without me, I understood it too. The door opened wider this time, not by accident, not by a careless hand, but with purpose, and I looked up just as Michael Bennett stepped out into the hallway, his expression composed in the way only someone with decades of practice could manage, though there was something beneath it now, something sharper, more attentive, as his eyes moved from the room behind him to me sitting there, still, exactly where I had been left. He paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for recognition to register, and then his gaze shifted slightly, as if confirming what he already suspected. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice calm but not casual, and there was a subtle change in the air around us, something that felt like a question being asked without being spoken. I inclined my head slightly, not rising, not rushing to explain, because I no longer felt the need to justify why I was sitting outside a room that should have included me. "They told me this meeting was for listed participants," I said, keeping my tone even, the words simple, factual, without accusation. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the open door, where the muted shapes of the meeting continued, unaware of the shift happening just beyond their view. When he looked back at me, the calm professionalism in his expression had not disappeared, but it had changed direction. It was no longer neutral. It was deliberate. "I see," he said quietly, and those two words carried more weight than anything that had been said inside that room. He adjusted the folder in his hand, a small, precise movement, and I noticed then that it was not one of the documents already being discussed. It was separate, set aside. "Were you informed in advance that you would not be attending?" he asked, and the phrasing itself told me everything I needed to know. This was not standard. This was not expected. "No," I replied, just as calmly, meeting his eyes without hesitation. There was another pause, longer this time, not uncomfortable but measured, as if he were aligning something in his mind, comparing what he had been told with what he was now seeing. From inside the room, Daniel's voice carried again, faint but insistent, continuing whatever discussion he believed was proceeding smoothly, efficiently according to plan. Michael did not turn back immediately. Instead, he looked at me once more, and for the first time since I had arrived, I felt something shift in my favor, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet precision. "Please wait here for a moment," he said, his tone steady, controlled, but no longer neutral, and there was a clarity in it now that had not been there before. I nodded once, not asking questions, not pressing for explanations, because I understood that whatever was about to happen did not require my intervention. It required recognition. He turned back toward the room then, the door opening fully this time, allowing the light and the voices to spill out briefly into the hallway before closing again behind him, and as it did, I noticed something I had not seen before. The way he held that separate folder, not loosely, not as an afterthought, but with intention, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to be used. I sat exactly as I was, my hands still folded in my lap, my posture unchanged, but the stillness inside me had taken on a different quality now. It was no longer the stillness of being excluded. It was the stillness of waiting for something that had already been set in motion long before I ever took that seat outside the door. Inside the conference room, the rhythm of the conversation shifted the moment Michael Bennett returned, not abruptly, not in a way that would alarm anyone unfamiliar with subtle changes, but enough that even from the hallway I could sense it, the way voices paused just a fraction longer before responding, the way the flow of discussion lost its earlier confidence. I did not need to see their faces to understand that something had been interrupted. I remained seated, my eyes resting on the closed door, listening without leaning forward, without straining, because whatever was happening now was no longer hidden behind uncertainty. It was unfolding. There was the sound of a chair being adjusted, followed by Michael's voice, steady and measured, carrying the authority of someone who was not asking for permission to speak. "Before we proceed any further," he said, and even through the barrier of the door, I could hear the shift in tone, the way the room would have quieted at those words alone. "There is an additional document that must be addressed." There was a brief silence after that, the kind that forms when people are recalibrating their expectations, and then Daniel's voice, controlled but no longer entirely relaxed. "What document?" he asked, and I recognized the edge in it, not sharp but present. Michael did not rush his response. "A secondary directive prepared by Thomas Carter," he replied, each word deliberate, placed carefully into the space between them, "to be reviewed under specific circumstances." Specific circumstances. The phrase lingered, and I could almost picture the way it would settle across the table, drawing attention, creating questions that had not been part of the original plan. Papers moved again, but this time the sound was different, slower, more deliberate, as if whatever Michael had brought with him required a different kind of attention. I heard him continue. This directive was to remain sealed unless certain conditions were met. Another pause followed, longer now, heavier, and then Daniel again, his voice tighter, less certain than before. "And what conditions are those?" Michael's answer came without hesitation. "The exclusion or limitation of Mrs. Carter from decisions regarding the estate." The words were clear, unmistakable, and even from where I sat, I felt the impact of them, not as a sudden shock, but as a confirmation of something that had already taken shape inside me. There was no immediate response from Daniel this time. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. Inside that room, the structure they had been building, the careful arrangement of decisions and assumptions, had just encountered something they had not accounted for. I remained still, my hands resting exactly where they had been, my posture unchanged, but the stillness inside me had shifted again, becoming something firmer, something grounded in the knowledge that I was no longer outside of what mattered. Michael's voice continued, calm, unwavering. "Given the current circumstances, this document is now in effect and must be read in full before any further actions are taken." There was a faint sound of a page being opened, the subtle movement of paper that carries weight far beyond its size, and I realized then that whatever Thomas had prepared, whatever he had placed into that folder with such quiet intention, it had not been a precaution. It had been a decision, one that extended beyond his presence, one that had been waiting for exactly this moment to be revealed. The room remained quiet for a moment after Michael opened the document, the kind of quiet that does not come from politeness but from recalculation, and I could almost feel the way each person at that table adjusted their understanding of what was happening, not outwardly, not in any dramatic gesture, but internally where decisions are truly made. Then Michael began to read, his voice steady and unhurried, each word carrying the same controlled precision that had defined everything he had said so far. "In the event that my wife, Evelyn Carter, is excluded, limited, or otherwise prevented from participating in any discussion or decision regarding my estate," he read, and I noticed how clearly he pronounced my name, not as a formality, but as a point of emphasis, "all primary authority over said estate shall be immediately transferred into a protected trust, overseen solely by appointed counsel." There was a faint movement inside the room, the sound of someone shifting in their chair, followed by the subtle pause of someone who had expected a different outcome. Michael continued without interruption. "This condition shall remain in effect indefinitely, and any attempt to proceed without her full inclusion shall constitute a direct violation of my expressed intent." The words did not rise in volume, they did not demand attention, but they commanded it all the same. I sat there listening, not with surprise, but with a quiet sense of alignment, as if something that had been uncertain had now settled into place. Inside the room, Daniel's voice came again, but it no longer carried the same confidence it had earlier. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, and even through the door, I could hear the careful control in his tone, the effort to maintain composure. Michael did not match that tone. He did not soften his response. "There is no misunderstanding," he said simply, and the simplicity of it made it final. Papers shifted again, this time more deliberately, and I imagined the way the document would be laid out on the table, visible to everyone, impossible to ignore. "Furthermore," Michael continued, "any party found to have initiated or supported the exclusion of Mrs. Carter shall forfeit any discretionary privileges previously granted under the original terms." The sentence was longer, more formal, but its meaning was unmistakable. There was no immediate reply after that. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer the silence of planning. It was the silence of consequence. I remained exactly where I was, my hands still resting in my lap, my posture unchanged, but inside, something had shifted with a clarity that did not require emotion to validate it. This was not a reversal born out of confrontation. This was a structure that had already been set in place, waiting for the exact moment it would be needed. Michael's voice continued, moving through the rest of the document with the same measured pace, outlining conditions, clarifying authority, reinforcing what had already been established, and with each sentence, the space between me and that room grew smaller, not physically, but in terms of control, of presence, of recognition. I did not need to step inside to understand what had changed. I could hear it in the absence of interruption, in the lack of confident responses, in the way the conversation no longer moved forward but paused, adjusted, reconsidered. And in that stillness, I understood something with absolute certainty. I had not been left out of that meeting. I had been placed exactly where I needed to be for the truth to reveal itself. The door opened again, this time without hesitation, and the shift in the air was immediate, as if something inside that room had reached a point where it could no longer remain contained, and I looked up to see Michael standing there, his posture unchanged but his presence now carrying a quiet authority that did not need to be announced. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and there was no uncertainty in his voice, no suggestion, no invitation waiting to be accepted. "Please come in." I rose slowly, not out of reluctance but out of control, smoothing my dress once more as I stepped toward the door, my movements steady, measured, the same way I had entered countless rooms throughout my life, but this time, the space I was stepping into had already been altered before I crossed the threshold. The conversation inside had stopped. Not abruptly, not awkwardly, but completely, as if every voice had recognized that something had shifted beyond discussion. Daniel sat where I had seen him before, but he looked different now, not physically, not in any obvious way, but in the way his eyes met mine for the first time that day. Not with distance, not with avoidance, but with something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood. I did not speak to him. I did not need to. I took the seat that had been empty, the one that should have been mine from the beginning, and I placed my hands on the table, not claiming anything, not asserting anything, simply existing in the space that had been denied to me minutes before. Michael remained standing for a moment, the second document still open in front of him, and then he closed it with the same deliberate care he had shown from the beginning. "We will proceed with full inclusion," he said, his tone even, final, and no one challenged it. No one questioned. The structure of the room had changed, not through argument, not through emotion, but through something far more decisive. Recognition. I glanced briefly at the document spread across the table, at the neat arrangement of pages that had been intended to move forward without me, and I realized how easily that could have happened if not for a man who had understood that presence alone was not always enough, that sometimes it had to be protected, defined, reinforced. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, a small movement almost imperceptible, but I noticed it the way I had noticed everything else that day, and I understood that whatever had been assumed, whatever had been planned, had not simply been interrupted. It had been revealed. I did not need to ask for explanations. I did not need to hear apologies. Those things belonged to a different kind of story, one where emotion filled the space that clarity now occupied. This was not that story. I sat there, calm, present, fully included, and I allowed the moment to settle exactly as it was, without reaching for anything more. Because the truth had already done what it needed to do. They had believed they could move forward without me, quietly, efficiently, as if my absence would simplify things. But what they had not understood was that I had never been something that could be removed without consequence. And as I sat at that table, no longer outside the door, I realized that I had not needed to fight to be seen. I had only needed to wait for what was already mine to be acknowledged.